random topics we deal with, we talk about population genetics. One of those, which really is part of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation, but it can't affect it, is a concept called eugenics. Eugenics has been around for a while, and it's actually starting to make a comeback, and people have concerns about it because it was very popular. It was kind of the in thing to do in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and then fell out of favor very quickly, partially because of some different people who were practitioners of it who supported it and became a problem. But you see now a rise in some cases, people advocating it, and certain different viewpoints, some maybe not as controversial as others. But eugenics is the idea of the improvement of a species through control of traits and selective breeding. In the past, that was literally selective breeding. Whether it be animals or humans, you basically tried to push those traits that you wanted into population. In humans, obviously very controversial, it has been done before. We don't like it, it's considered a dark history in our chapter in our history of our humankind, but it is something that has happened before. First introduced as a philosophy in the 1800s, even though people did things like this prior to that, the philosophy of eugenics, especially in the case of humans, really hit popularity in the 1800s. A lot of famous politicians, famous scientists believed in it. Some of them from a standpoint of, I want to improve humanity to make it better, get rid of diseases, things like that. And even today, that is an argument that some people have. But then other people took it to a different extreme. It became more widespread in the early 1900s. Around the turn of the century with the modern revolution, the revolution of the Industrial Revolution, changes in living conditions, things like that, people started to have some concepts of how we should try to improve humans. Genetics come around in the early 1900s, people want to start, how can we do it better? How can we make it work? So many governments actually actively supported this idea, including the United States and other countries as well. Some were more radical than others, some were less radical. There are countries today that still kind of have a swing towards that philosophy. Some examples. Some countries put marriage restrictions, whether it was for racial concepts or religious concepts or all kinds of things people deemed that they didn't like, political even in some cases. So those kind of things, ethnic, there's all kinds of arguments that people did for marriage restrictions. So that has occurred in lots of countries, and it was a case where people did do those things. Forced sterilizations. There were countries that basically forced people who had mental issues or different physical defects, they would basically take them to the hospital and sterilize them so that they couldn't have children and pass their genes on. They were trying to get rid of them out of the population. Fourth, forced euthanasia. Obviously, there's one particular government who is very well known for doing this. It's something that is a dark chapter again in human history, where people took people they didn't like and they went out and basically killed them off, whether it was sick, injured, ethnicities, whatever. Some of them did it for people who had mental handicaps, physical defects, all those kind of things that they didn't like. So they got rid of it that way. That led to genocides in many countries where maybe they just went out and killed a bunch of people who they didn't like, who didn't fit their mold. So that has occurred, still does occur in many countries, unfortunately. So there is eugenics people, it's just not as mainstream popular as it was at that point in time in the early 1900s. So the modern eugenics, does it really happen today? Absolutely. Could it happen? Absolutely does. There are people, a lot of people today are saying, well, let's do things like, I want to manipulate the genes, I want to make better children, I want to make better humans, I want to try to get rid of bad traits, make the smartest, the fastest, the quickest, all those things that people argue about. It's a controversial subject. Some people are very much for it, some people are very much against it, some people like parts of it and hate other parts of it. It's a huge controversial discussion. Some possible factors, things like genetic screening are brought up. People say, well, if you're genetically screening, are we using that data to just determine if people have problems, or is it being used to determine separations of groups based upon traits you have? Some people have concerns about that. Cloning. Obviously, if you start to clone people, can you start to manipulate them? Can you start to produce the people you want and not the people you don't want? Gene manipulation. Can I get rid of that gene I don't like? Can I make this one work differently? Can I do some things? We can see positives to it, but there's also negatives to it. People have arguments on both sides of the story. So why is eugenics bad for a population? Well, it's really simple. Think about it. If I'm selecting only certain traits, I'm driving away genetic diversity. I'm really affecting that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium in that way. I'm getting rid of things. I'm doing basically what inbreeding does, except for I'm targeting it. I'm just getting rid of things I don't like. I'm making it only certain ways that things can occur. So there are a lot of people who are very famous, you'd be surprised, were supporters of eugenics. So for example, Charles Lindbergh was one. He believed in trying to improve people through doing medicines and trying to create better surgeries and do those kind of things like that. H.G. Wells, who later denounced it. Matter of fact, he was so much against it at that point that he wrote a book called The Island Dr. Moreau, which was about a man who basically took animal and humans and hybridized them. And that was his way of denouncing eugenics. John Harvey Kellogg, most famously known for Kellogg's cereals. He was a big believer in health, body, mind, all those kind of things like that, trying to improve the human body through healthy living and healthy eating. He was a big believer in eugenics. Herbert Hoover, President of the United States, also believed that you should basically try to improve human conditions. Robert Millikan, one of the famous ones from chemistry, also was a believer in this. Linus Pauling, two-time Nobel Prize winner, believed, and is also one of the people who we talked about being trying to come up with an idea for how DNA worked and structured DNA, and was competing against Watson and Crick. And he's also very famous for his ideas on eugenics as well. Watson and Crick themselves, both eugenicists. They're a little bit more extreme. They actually did believe you should basically eliminate people from the population and not let them have children if they didn't have right traits, things like that. They had some controversial viewpoints on those. And of course, Adolf Hitler. The Nazis were very famous for their viewpoints of eugenics. They had very specific views of how they viewed people should be or should not be based on that concept. So they're the ones who really people know as major eugenists. Some odd facts about genetics, about populations. And one of the things I'll say is, why is platypuses are so odd? They have 10 sex chromosomes. Humans have 2, X and Y. They have 10. So even among mammals they're weird besides just laying eggs. They have a bunch of weird numbers like that. They have 5 Ys and 5 X's for males, and they have 10 X's for females. So they have 5 sets of sex chromosomes for producing their genders. The SRY gene, which determines maleness in mammals, is actually absent on the Y chromosome. So on every other mammal that's on the Y chromosome, which makes a male, they don't have it. Something else causes them to be male. Probably something more primitive like a reptile. Maybe it's temperature control, they're not 100% certain on it because they do lay eggs, so it's got some similarities that way. They have a bird gene for maleness located on an X chromosome, so it is kind of similar that way, but we're not still sure it works that way. So it may work more like a reptile. There's some funny gene names. Now, some of these have been changed because people in science get very upset when you have funny names. So the Groucho gene in fruit flies was one they named. They renamed it later because people complained about it. It produces extra facial bristles, and Groucho Marx had big, large eyebrows and mustache, so because of that, they said the fly looked like Groucho Marx, so they called it the Groucho gene. The cheap date gene in fruit flies, which causes them to be very sensitive to alcohol. They also changed it to, I think it's like gene X47, gave it a number to it. The Human Genome Organization is planning to rename all of them, and they actually have since I put the notes together. I can't remember what the number designation they gave to it is, but they did give it a number designation. Human body lice have 18 mitochondrial chromosomes. We have 1. So they have more than we do. We have 1. A single gene controls pain perception in humans. So if that gene gets turned off, you don't feel pain, which sounds great, but it's actually a bad thing. Alligators are genetically immune to most pathogens. They have one of the strongest and most effective immune systems genetically that allows them to adapt to almost anything that they come in contact with, which means they're immune to most things as pathogens since the environments they live in. The food they eat is usually rotting, so it's kind of an effective method for them. Junk DNA is actually useful, which we did mention before. We call it junk DNA, but it's actually used for multiple different purposes.